Dick Hammer embodied the Dixie spirit. He came here from somewhere else and loved this place, loved the people, met his dear wife here, raised his family here, and became a part of this place.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
The downtown of St. George has changed a lot in the last few decades. A lot of really iconic buildings and places that were there during the heart of the 1900s are gone now. One of those is a building that was on the corner of First East and Old Highway 91, as we called it then, but it's St. George Boulevard now, on the southeast corner of First East and St. George Boulevard, where there's now a 3-story commercial office building on that corner. There once stood, for many decades, one of the great institutions of St. George. It was called Dick's Cafe. And Ricky, I'm looking at you right now from a generation or two younger than me. Have you ever heard of Dick's Cafe?
I don't think I have, or maybe a vague memory if we've ever mentioned it on this podcast. I feel like this would be the only place I'd ever have heard its name.
Okay, so you are in for an education today, as well as perhaps many of our listeners. But I would think that most of our listeners have very specific memories of Dick's Cafe and fond memories of that great place and different kinds of memories because it meant different things to different people. And yet, my children and my grandchildren would only vaguely relate to that. And so it's fun to take a look here. And what I've done, I've gone back to an issue of St. George Magazine, fall of 1985. So that is almost exactly, well, it is exactly 40 years ago. And I found this article that I wrote about Dick's Cafe. And the reason I wrote the article in 1985 is because it was the 50th anniversary of Dick's Cafe, which began in 1935. As I share this today, some of the context here relates to that 50th anniversary, but we can look back now with 2020 hindsight and know that Dick's Cafe did finally end as the century ended in, I think, 1999. And that building, that restaurant, that iconic institution of St. George went away, and a big 3-story office building sits there now. Let me share this. About the time Hitler began plotting to overthrow Europe, the first patrons started plotting at the counter of Dick's Cafe. FDR was president. We were in the middle of the Great Depression, and the Cubs and Tigers were on their way to penance. A loaf of bread was going for 8 cents, a thick pound of steak for 36 cents, and you could buy a brand new Ford for $510. Betty Davis was the nation's leading lady, and Alice Faye was singing, "I'm in the mood for love." Among all this, a 32-year-old entrepreneur named Dick Hammer was opening the doors of a cafe that bore his name. Since that historic day in June of 1935, depressions and recessions have come and gone. Baseball teams have climbed to glory and toppled. Movies have played and been forgotten. Businesses have thrived and faded, but Dick's Cafe on the corner of St. George Boulevard and First East weathered it all. A half-century of fine food, friendly service, and good company. It's one of the few remaining institutions of Old St. George, a tangible link with the city's past. And like I said, it no longer exists. But at that time, as I wrote this article, it was one of those few remaining institutions of Old St. George. My earliest recollection of Dick's only goes back to the midpoint of the cafe's history. In the early 1960s, Dick used to give a T-bone steak dinner to any kid who could ride a calf past the first light pole at the New Year's Day rodeo. I didn't have the foggiest idea what a T-bone was, but all the other kids were risking their lives for one, so I figured it must be a fine prize. My friend Les Bracken got on one of the wiry little Holsteins first. He rode the feisty critter past the light pole, which was about 100 feet from the chute at the old Sheriff's Posse Arena northwest of town. Les, sure enough, won himself a T-bone, but in the process got kicked in the face. He was still bawling and holding his bloody nose when I climbed down on my calf. The chute gate opened, the calf darted, and I rolled in the soft sand of the posse grounds. Tough luck, the rodeo announcer said, but for such a brave try, Dad took me to Dick's anyway. Rather than a T-bone, I had a chicken fried steak. I would not allow myself the true prize without earning it. Dick himself came over and sat at the booth with Dad and me. It made quite an impression on a young buckaroo such as myself. Dick's been making that same impression on people for 50 years now, not just on little calf-riding cowpokes, but on truckers, tourists, traveling salesmen, local businessmen and tradesmen, civic groups, and world-famous celebrities. Most everyone who has ever walked into Dick's has left with not only a satisfied appetite, but a good helping of Southern Utah hospitality to boot, said Neil Lundberg, a regular at Dick's for nearly a half-century. Most people will tell you it's that hospitality that's been the secret to Dick's 50 successful years in the restaurant business. The story of Dick's Cafe begins in 1935, but the story of Dick Hammer goes all the way back to 1903 and the farming town of Mount Sterling, Illinois, where he was born. A couple of brothers, Leo and Louis, were in the restaurant business near Mount Sterling, but Dick found his pleasure on the farm. A Mormon family lived nearby, Dick recalls. They had the most beautiful farm you ever saw. I stayed with them quite a bit and rode their horses. They had a few race horses. In his teens, Dick set out on his own. I didn't like the cold weather in Illinois, so I took off and ended up in Colorado. Times were awful, though, but he got work on his uncle's ranch in Colorado before drifting on west to California. I worked all over Southern California, mostly in restaurants and hotels, Dick says. Then I took a job on a passenger liner and made 9 trips to Hawaii before I gave that up. He bought a dude outfit at Big Bear Lake, California, which he ran in the summers, and for 2 winters he ran a restaurant at Pine Knot. One of those winters, in the early 1930s, was the winter of the big snows. We were snowed in 11 days up there, Dick recalls. 500 people, and I was the only place with food. The food ran out quick. That's when I learned that when people get hungry, they get mean, Dick said. They couldn't get any food to us, so I went to a trapper friend who had 8 burros. We killed those burros, and the people were happy to eat them. After the experience at Big Bear, Dick took a job at Beaver Dam Lodge in Arizona, a few miles southwest of St. George. There he got $25 a month, plus room and board. But most importantly, he got acquainted with a town in southwestern Utah, which would become his final home. I'd never seen or heard of St. George before that, Dick says. I got a job with George Pace at the Big Hand Cafe, and I worked for Jockey Hale at the Liberty. Fred Schultz had opened a place on this corner where we are now, converted it from a fruit stand, and I leased it from him and opened my own restaurant. He worked at the Big Hand for another week before opening his own place to give him some cash flow. I had $3 the first day I opened. That was June 20th, 1935, and I paid my rent every night. It was $1 a day for rent, $1 a day for a waitress, and Dick did the rest himself. I paid everything as I went, he said. Originally, his clientele consisted of cowboys, sheepmen, miners, and a few people passing through. But it wasn't long before people began coming through St. George by the hundreds along Highway 91, which just happened to pass right by Dick's front door. There were times when we got so many trucks parked out there, we didn't know how we'd handle them, Dick says. We had good cooperation from the local service stations, he said. They send a lot of people our way, but the real key to steady success, he said, has been the established clientele that has stayed with us through the years. Dick has always paid attention to his business, Neil Lundberg said. He's a true host. He's been greeting his customers and paying attention to them for 50 years, and he remembers you when you come back. There's always been a Western theme at Dick's. It carries back to those horse riding days on the farm in Illinois. But once Dick Hammer established himself in St. George, he began to pick up the skills of the real Western cowboy. Bill Shanley taught him to rope, and Slats Jacobs taught him the ins and outs of rodeo. Ez MacArthur taught him the finer points of horsemanship, and it wasn't long before Dick was into big-time rodeo. For 18 years, he carried a Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association card and still carried that association's lifetime gold card with the number 256 on it. We went everywhere, says Dick, whose specialty was calf roping. We went to rodeos in Wyoming, Idaho, Nebraska, and California. We went to Iowa, St. Louis, Chicago, and all the way to Madison Square Garden in New York. That was during the 1940s and early 50s. Though he spent a lot of time on the road, he didn't forget the restaurant. I was lucky to have a good wife who took care of things, Dick said. And everywhere I rodeoed, I entered under the name of Dick's Cafe. It was the subtle knack for promotion that gained Dick's Cafe a reputation all across the United States. Dick became friends with the big names in rodeo. Many of those world-class cowboys would come to the Dixie Roundup in St. George each September and make Dick's their headquarters. For years, a long bench in front of the cafe was filled with cowboys who came to town at roundup time and spent several days before the rodeo. Along in the mid-1950s, Dick's knees started going bad, so he gave up rodeo for the sport of cow cutting. I decided if I was going into it, I was going in big, Dick said. He went to Texas and bought a well-trained, well-bred cutting horse, gelding, named Maxan, and paid for him with the winnings from 2 cutting shows on the way home. Then he discovered a black mare in Salmon, Idaho, named Jetta, that looked just like Maxan. He bought the mare and began taking both horses to cutting shows across the country. Local horse trainer Connie Bowler traveled with Dick, and between the two riders and the two horses, they got first and second place at many shows. Both of the coal-black horses lived into their 30s, and Maxanne was immortalized by the gleaming black statue that stood in the parking lot of Dick's Cafe. Through the years, Dick has owned a number of top cutting and roping horses. For several winters, some of the best cutting horse trainers stayed at Dick's old place south of St. George to train and to participate in the annual winter cutting show that Dick sponsored. Trainers like Slim Trent and Carl Taylor of Texas, Roy Carpenter of New Mexico, and Austin Beebe of Utah found St. George an ideal place to be in the wintertime. We got as many as 118 horses to the cutting back in those days, Dick says. That brought a lot of people into the area, and the economy needed them. Another side to Dick's Cafe is its tie to the movie industry. Early on, Dick got involved with the movies, catering to the companies that came to town to film. He did a lot of active promotion to get movies filmed here. We'd take pictures of the area and then go to Hollywood and meet with producers to get them up here, he said. The result was a movie heyday in St. George during the 1950s and early 60s. Dick himself not only provided food and comfort for the crews, but got himself in front of the camera as well. He worked as an extra in several films and even took a key role in the Western called Stallion Canyon. I became good friends with John Wayne, Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, and a lot of those stars, Dick said. They all spent time at the cafe, and it was their hangout while they were here. More recently, Robert Redford and Jane Fonda spent a few days at Dick's filming one of the classic scenes of The Electric Horseman. We closed the cafe for 4 days while they shot that scene, Dick said. The company paid us for the business we lost. For years, Milburn Stone and Ken Curtis, Doc and Festus of Gunsmoke, would stop at Dick's on their way to fishing holes in Utah. They'd come in the morning before I got there and wait around until I showed up, Dick recalls. If a waitress offered to call me and tell me they were there, they'd say, "Let the old horse sleep." It's seldom, though, that you go into Dick's when he's not there. Over the years, except when he's been off to rodeos and cow cuttings, he's stayed close to the counter, continually greeting his customers and taking care of business. Even now, with his sons Nick and Craig ably taking care of things, Dick spends a good share of each day at the cafe. He makes sure everything is done right, Neil Lundberg said. He's as fine a businessman as this country has ever seen. Dick has stayed neck and neck with the times, remodeling his cafe 5 times over 50 years, and he's modernized wherever necessary. But that's about all that's changed at Dick's. It's still a fine place to eat and relax, a good place to escape the hustle of modern life and drift back to slower times. And it's still one of the best places in town to find out what's going on. There have been a lot of things discussed at that counter, Lundberg said, some much more important than others. He recalls sitting at the counter one day talking with other members of the Lions Club about building a new rodeo grounds. Tom Watson, the artist, was sitting there, and I asked him what he'd charge to paint a rendition of the concept I had in mind, Lundberg recalls. Tom said what he'd do it for, and Dick, who was listening in on the conversation, said he'd take it off Tom's meal tab. The next day, Dick called Lundberg and told him to get up to the cafe. Tom was there with a beautiful painting of what would soon become the Lions Dixie Sun Bowl, said Lundberg. You can bet that a lot of important ideas for Dixie were spawned at the counter of Dick's Cafe. And though much of the city's idle chatter is now spread across a wide variety of eating establishments, there are still plenty of stories told at Dick's, plenty of plans made, and plenty of dreams born. Dick Hammer is a very human person, Neil Lundberg said. Years ago, you saw a lot of hungry people on the streets. I don't think anyone has ever come through Dick's door truly hungry who walked away without being fed. Dick might have given him a broom or a dish rag, but the man didn't go away hungry. That's the way it's been at Dick's for 50 years. And there's no reason to think it will be any different for the next 50. So that's the way I wrote it, Ricky, 40 years ago. Sadly, it didn't make the next 50, but the 60 or so years that it existed on St. George Boulevard on Old Highway 91, it was an just an iconic place that people all across the country knew about and talked about, and it was the place to stop when you came to St. George.
Did Dick run it until the end? I'm wondering if it ended because he didn't do a transition or anything like that.
I think that Dick's wife, who was such an amazing lady, she passed away, and then Dick became old. His son, Nick, ran it, I think, up until the time that it did close. And I think it was just a natural time for it to end. That property is really prime property in St. George, and I don't know all the particulars of what happened there, but that it became the old cafe building came down, and a 3-story office building was built there. Actually, it was built as a bank. Sunfirst Bank, I believe, is what it was called there. And then there have been other iterations of companies and offices that have been in that building for the last 25 years.
I wish that we could, say, raise your hand if you've been to Dick's Cafe, but I'm curious if you have an estimate on how many people you think that are around in St. George now who have been there.
I think anyone born before 1970 or even later than that probably went to Dick's with their family or was very much aware of that restaurant. My family didn't go out to eat much, and so when there was that special occasion that you would go out, that's where we went, unless it was the Frost Top down on the other end of the boulevard, and that's another great story for another time. But to go to an actual restaurant and have a dining experience, that was a unique thing, at least when I was a kid. And to actually go there and have a steak, I mean, that was something really, really big. And I've always remembered very vividly that first experience at Dick's because I went there with my dad, and I didn't win a T-bone steak, but my dad was giving me the consolation prize for trying. I think about you and your kids, and I think about Sam. He won the mutton busting at the Dixie Roundup a couple of years ago, and that was a very similar thing where out at the old posse grounds, we didn't have mutton busting, but we had calf riding. And if you could ride that calf past that first light pole, supposedly, that won you a T-bone steak at Dick's. And so if you went to redeem it, it was redeemed at the restaurant. And so it was a great way to get a lot of us kids in town to the restaurant for the first time.
For those of us who aren't as familiar with rodeo, what's cow cutting?
Oh, cutting is if you're not familiar with it, then that name cutting can have a wrong connotation, but what cow cutting is a very specialized and awesome horse sport where a horse that is bred to be a cow horse, you ride that horse into a herd and you bring one cow out of that herd. And then you keep that cow from going back into the herd. So you're cutting.
Okay.
Cutting. It's not have anything to do with physical cutting. It has to do with cutting a cow out of a herd, and then that horse in just an amazing display of poetry in motion, that horse moves with the cow and does not allow that cow to return to the herd for a few seconds. It's just something that happens for 20, 30, 40 seconds. And then that cow goes back to the herd and the rider goes back in and brings another cow out. Okay. And just, it's a way to display the amazing ability of a cutting horse. And it's a quarter horse that's bred to cut cattle out of the herd. And also to display horsemanship at its highest level. I've always thought of a rodeo as the cowboy sport, but cutting is the horseman sport. And I've always thought of it as on this level above, because so many people are involved in roping and riding and rough stock events and rodeo. And Dick Hammer did that for a lot of years. He was a roper. But then when his knees gave out, he turned to cutting. And it's so specialized. It's also a very expensive sport because you have to invest in a well-bred, well-trained horse. And there's a lot of maintenance to all of that. And yet, it's really, in my mind, it's the ultimate of horsemanship. A great horse and a great rider being able to perform in a very defined way and show that horse's ability and the rider's horsemanship.
So for Dick, would that have been a hobby, or was that also something that would bring income?
It was a hobby, of course. It was something that he loved, but it was also something that he could earn money doing. If you're at the top of that sport, you can earn money. As it indicates in this article, he bought his first quarter horse in Texas, his cutting horse in Texas. And what he said is that on his way home, he paid for that horse with the winnings at 2 cutting events that he attended on his way home. And he loved those 2 horses. They were legendary cutting horses that he brought to St. George. And Maxan, that first gelding that he bought in Texas, was immortalized in a statue that stood right on St. George Boulevard next to the cafe in the parking lot. Most people probably didn't know that story of who that horse was or what it was, but it was Dick's way of immortalizing a horse that he loved and a horse that made him a lot of money. Yeah. And that was truly an amazing animal. I remember dragging Maine as a kid and as a teenager, and every time you went past Dick's, you saw that statue of that horse. I didn't know a lot of the story at that point, but I did know that was an image of his horse.
I like how he unified both his entrepreneurial efforts with the cafe and also the marketing branding that he did in the rodeo.
Dick, he was a great promoter, and he could talk a great story, but he could also back it up. And his cafe was successful because of the marketing that he did, and he really did have a great marketing sense for an old cowboy. Yeah. But I do really think that he was that salesman first and then became a cowboy, and then that all mixed together in a really neat way. Dick's Cafe was where all the old cowboys came together almost on a daily basis if they were able to get there. And sitting around his coffee counter were legendary people. And like Neil Lundberg said 40 years ago when I interviewed him, there were a lot of plans made around that coffee counter and a lot of stories told. And that continued through the generations there right up until the cafe closed. And that's just been 25, 26 years ago. But you could still drive past there and see a lot of the great old cowboys sitting at the counter through the window there. And I always tried to imagine what they were talking about and the stories they were telling. My dad was not a regular there at the counter. He was always too busy somewhere else. Not that those cowboys weren't busy, but I think a lot of them got up early in the morning and got a lot of chores done and then spend an hour or so sitting at the counter for breakfast or for their morning coffee and talking. And that was an amazing tradition. And there were regulars there that sat in their regular chair every morning or every afternoon. It's kind of like Cheers, and I don't know if you even relate to the TV program Cheers, where
I think I've been there.
You having lived in Boston, you've been there. But it's a place that you would walk into and you had your seat at the counter and everybody knew your name. And it was an awesome thing. And Dick, he worked hard to make all of that real. But he was a showman. He was right there in the middle of all the movies that were happening during those decades. And he was ready to be a caterer there, but he was also ready to be a double in a Western scene or a stuntman in a scene, or in the case of Stallion Canyon, he actually had a role in that movie. I've never seen that movie. I don't know if it still exists, but he was one of the stars in it. And like other people in town, he really was on a first-name basis with some of the most iconic stars of that generation, John Wayne and Gary Cooper and Clark Gable, and that list goes on, and all the way up to Robert Redford and Jane Fonda when they came. And I think Dick's Cafe was immortalized in that movie because the final scene is filmed there, and they get on the bus there, the Trailways bus, and I think that's probably where the Trailways bus stopped on its way from Los Angeles to Salt Lake. And so, again, I just remember going in. He had a curio shop, which is a fancy name for a gift shop, and with a lot of Western knickknacks and souvenirs and different things. It was kind of around the corner in the back part of the building, and Dick had his office back there. And I remember Dad taking me in there when he had something to talk to Dick about, and I was a kid, and Dick would be sitting there in his chair. He had a big old cigar in his mouth, and he was quite an imposing character for a little kid in St. George to walk into his office and see him. But there's such an interesting transition there and juxtaposition that I remember, because I don't know what year Dick died, but he was in his 90s. And so this would have been in the maybe early 1990s. And I remember walking into the St. George Temple Visitor Center, and I remember seeing Dick there, and he was seated there, and the sister missionaries were visiting with him, and he was just having the best visit with the sister missionaries. And I remember saying hello to him and asking him how he was doing. And by that time in his life, he didn't have a big cigar in his mouth. He had a big smile and an essence about him and I don't know all the details, but he had come full circle spiritually as well. And he loved being there at the temple and learning more about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it was just an interesting for me to experience, remembering as a little boy, seeing him there in his office and in his domain, and then as an old man near the end of his life, there learning more about the gospel.
Yeah. Becoming like a child. Learning.
As we've been talking, Ricky, I have this vague memory that Dick Hammer was mentioned in General Conference in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it runs in my mind that President Monson, President Thomas S. Monson, talked about him in a priesthood session in conference.
We should look it up.
Hey, do you think you could search that and find it?
Yeah. Scripture Citation Index is the tool I use for that. 2013, President Monson mentions Dick Hammer here.
Oh, my goodness.
He says, Dick Hammer came to Utah with the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression. He met and married a Latter-day Saint young woman. He opened Dick's Cafe in St. George, Utah, which became a popular meeting spot. Assigned as home teacher to the Hammer family was Willard Millen, a friend of mine. Since I knew Dick Hammer as well, having printed the menus for his cafe, I would ask my friend Brother Millen when I visited St. George, "How's our friend Dick Hammer coming?" The reply would generally be, "He's coming, but slowly." When Willard Millen and his companion visited the Hammer home each month, they always managed to present a gospel message and to share their testimonies with Dick and the family. The years passed by, and then one day Willard phoned me with good news. "Brother Monson," he began, "Dick Hammer is converted and is going to be baptized. He is in his 90th year, and we have been friends all our adult lives. His decision warms my heart. I've been his home teacher for many years." There was a catch in Willard's voice as he conveyed his welcome message. Brother Hammer was indeed baptized, and a year later entered that beautiful St. George Temple, and there received his endowment and sealing blessings.
My goodness. I knew there was more to that story as I was sharing that, and that just brings that all together, my memory of seeing him and visiting with him in the Temple Visitor Center. I think those awesome sister missionaries were very effective along with his erstwhile home teacher, Willard Millen, who was there all those years for him. There's so much more story to all of this, but I'm glad we captured that.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to see it documented from that perspective as well. I think my only other question is about your thoughts on how it has affected or relates to the Dixie Spirit.
Well, I think that so much of the Dixie Spirit was spawned around that counter at Dick's Cafe, or in the booths or at the tables of Dick's Cafe. Neil Lombard talked about the fact that they were sitting there at that counter when he shared his idea of what the Sun Bowl could look like. Mm-hmm. They were already starting to raise some money to bring it all together right after World War II. And Tom Watson was there, and he was an artist. And Dick told him if he would do a rendition of what that would look like, according to Neil's vision, that he would take that off his meal tab. And so there we have the Lions Sun Bowl, which is, interestingly enough, this year is going to be the last year that we'll experience the rodeo there in its traditional physical form, because the city is going to come in and completely redo the Sun Bowl. It will still be the Sun Bowl. It will still be in the same place, and it will be much more accessible, much more comfortable, and accommodate many, many more people. So that original vision that the Lions had back in 1946, that came out of those guys sitting around the counter at Dick's Cafe, And now we're going to move into a new era with the Sun Bowl, but it'll still be the Sun Bowl. And it's pretty awesome to think. So really, that whole idea, I think Dick Hammer embodied the Dixie spirit. He came here from somewhere else and loved this place, loved the people, met his dear wife here, raised his family here, and became a part of this place as someone from somewhere else. And he really did embody that Dixie spirit. He was behind so many of the great community events that occurred here. And he created that venue where so much of the Dixie spirit was spawned in his restaurant.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds were